On the morning of March 5th, 1979, two FBI agents knocked on the door of a modest home in Arlington Heights, Illinois, a suburb northwest of Chicago where ranch houses lined streets, and the biggest concern most residents had was whether the Cubs would have a decent season. The agents weren't there to arrest anyone. They were there because of a phone call made the previous Friday night by a couple who claimed their 13-year-old son had discovered something impossible, something that, if true, represented one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever uncovered on American soil. What the boy had found was a working cipher hidden inside the Sears Roebuck and Company catalog, the thick book that arrived in millions of American mailboxes and sat on coffee tables from Maine to California. Over the course of the investigation, at least 10 people would be arrested, a covert communication network would be dismantled, and the way American counterintelligence thought about dead drops and coded messages would fundamentally change. The boy's name was Michael Hartley, and to understand what he discovered, you have to understand who he was and what the world looked like in the spring of 1979. The Cold War had been grinding forward for more than 3 decades by then, and while it had cooled somewhat from the near-apocalyptic tensions of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the espionage game between the United States and the Soviet Union remained as active as ever. The KGB and the CIA still ran agents in each other's capitals. The U.S. intelligence community was still reeling from revelations about CIA domestic surveillance programs that had been exposed just a few years earlier during the Church Committee hearings, creating an atmosphere of paranoia and mistrust that had seeped into American culture. Meanwhile, the Soviets had been caught running at least 3 major spy rings in the United States during the 1970s, and counterintelligence officials knew there were more they hadn't found yet. Michael Hartley lived with his parents, Gordon and Patricia Hartley, and his younger sister, Rachel, in a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone else and kids still played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Gordon worked as an electrical engineer at Motorola's Arlington Heights facility. Patricia was a substitute teacher at the local middle school. Michael attended middle school, where he was known as quiet, brilliant, and different in ways that teachers and students alike struggled to articulate. This was 1979. An autism spectrum disorder wouldn't enter the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual until 1980. Most people in America had never heard the word autism unless they'd seen Rain Man, but that wouldn't come out until 1988. But Michael's parents knew their son processed the world differently than other children did. He'd spoken late, nearly 4 years old before he managed full sentences, but by age 6, he was reading at a high school level. He struggled with eye contact, found small talk nearly impossible, became overwhelmed by loud noises or unexpected changes in routine, and developed intense, almost obsessive interests that would consume him completely for months or years at a time. His current obsession, the one that had taken over his life since the previous summer, was patterns. Not just any patterns, but numerical patterns, specifically codes and ciphers. It had started when his father brought home a book from the library called The Code Breakers by David Kahn, a massive 1,200-page history of cryptography. Most 13-year-olds would have flipped through it and gotten bored. Michael read it cover to cover 3 times. He started checking out every book on codes and cryptography the Arlington Heights library system had. He taught himself about substitution ciphers, transposition ciphers, one-time pads, the Enigma machine, Navajo code talkers, Julius Caesar's cipher, the Zimmerman telegram. He filled notebooks with his own encryption systems, creating elaborate codes for messages that said things like, "I fed the dog," or "It's raining today." Messages that didn't need to be secret, but that Michael encoded anyway because he loved the process, the mathematical elegance of concealing information in plain sight. His parents found it harmless, even charming in a way. When Michael got interested in something, he pursued it with a single-minded intensity that was simultaneously exhausting and impressive. Patricia Hartley would later tell investigators that she sometimes worried about Michael's ability to make friends or function in social situations that required spontaneity and emotional intuition, but she never worried about his intelligence. He was, by any measure, exceptionally bright. His teachers confirmed this. Michael's math teacher, Eleanor Kowalski, told the FBI that Michael had essentially stopped participating in her 8th grade algebra class by October because he'd taught himself calculus over the summer and found the regular curriculum boring. He sat in the back and worked through college-level math textbooks he checked out from the public library while she taught quadratic equations to his classmates. The Sears catalog entered Michael's life the same way it entered millions of American homes, through the mail. The Spring-Summer 1979 catalog arrived at the Hartley household on the first week of February, a 1,400-page monster of a book weighing over 2 pounds, its glossy pages packed with everything from washing machines to wedding rings, power tools to patio furniture, boys' jeans to fishing rods. The catalog was as much a part of American life as baseball or apple pie, a cultural institution that had existed since 1888 and that reached virtually every household in the country. For most people, it was a shopping tool, a way to browse and order products from the comfort of home. For Michael Hartley, it became something else entirely. He noticed the pattern on February 11th, 1979, a Sunday afternoon. The family had just returned from church, and Michael was lying on the living room floor with the catalog open in front of him, which wasn't unusual. He often looked through catalogs or phone books or dictionaries, not because he wanted to buy anything or call anyone or learn definitions, but because he liked the organization of it, the systematic way information was presented. On this particular afternoon, he was looking at the automotive section, pages devoted to car batteries and motor oil, when something caught his attention. Certain product descriptions seemed wrong, not incorrect exactly, but awkward, phrased in ways that didn't quite match the natural rhythm of the rest of the catalog's text. Most people would have dismissed it as sloppy copywriting or a printing error. Michael's brain didn't work that way. When he saw something that didn't fit the pattern, it bothered him the same way a piece of music played in the wrong key might bother a person with perfect pitch. He started going through the catalog page by page, reading every product description, and he began to notice more of them. These slightly off phrases scattered throughout the book. They appeared maybe once every 40 or 50 pages, always buried in dense blocks of text where most people's eyes would skip right over them. He started making notes. In a fresh composition notebook, he began recording every unusual phrase he found, along with the page number, product category, and item number. The work was tedious and would have driven most teenagers crazy, but Michael found it soothing. He enjoyed the methodical process of searching and recording. By the end of that first day, he had 17 phrases written down. By the end of the week, he had found 43. The phrases themselves seemed meaningless, tested under extreme northern conditions, available in regional markets only, recommended for industrial applications. They were the kind of bland, technical language that appeared in thousands of product descriptions throughout the catalog, but Michael had noticed that these particular phrases broke certain grammatical or logical patterns that held true everywhere else in the book. On February 18th, exactly 1 week after he'd started, Michael decided to test a hypothesis. He'd been reading about number stations, those mysterious shortwave radio broadcasts that transmitted seemingly random sequences of numbers or words, widely believed to be coded messages for foreign agents operating in enemy countries. The broadcasts had been documented since World War I, and despite decades of monitoring by intelligence agencies, no government had ever officially acknowledged running them. Michael wondered if the Sears catalog phrases could work the same way, if they were messages hidden in plain sight, meant to be read only by people who knew where to look and how to decode them. He started with the simplest possible approach, the one that had been used in codes for centuries. He took the first letter of each unusual phrase in the order they appeared in the catalog from front to back and wrote them down in sequence. Terraire Motelgen dem Cap. Nothing. Just random letters. He tried the last letter of each phrase. Sneer Sigzindin. Still nothing. He tried taking the first letter of every other phrase, every third phrase, every fifth phrase. He tried numerology approaches, assigning numbers to letters. He tried looking at the product numbers themselves, searching for mathematical relationships. Nothing worked. Days passed, then weeks, and Michael filled page after page of his notebook with failed attempts. Most people would have given up. Most people would have concluded they were seeing patterns where none existed, that the awkward phrases were just awkward phrases and nothing more. But Michael's particular way of thinking made giving up almost impossible once he'd convinced himself a pattern existed. His mother would later describe to FBI investigators how Michael would come home from school, grab a snack, and go straight to his room to work on what he called the catalog problem. He'd skip dinner some nights, so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear his mother calling him. His grades, which had always been excellent, started to slip slightly, not because he couldn't do the work, but because he was spending all his time on the code instead of his homework. The breakthrough came on March 2nd, 1979, nearly 3 weeks after he'd started. Michael was lying in bed that evening, thinking about everything he'd tried and failed. He'd been approaching the problem as if the message was encoded in the text itself. But what if the text wasn't the message? What if the text was just a marker, a way of pointing to something else? He got out of bed, turned on his desk lamp, and pulled out the catalog again. He looked at one of the phrases he'd marked, tested under extreme northern conditions, which appeared on page 487 in the description for a set of jumper cables, item number 369427. What if the numbers mattered more than the words? He started writing down just the numbers associated with each unusual phrase, the page number, and the item number, 487, 36, 9427. He tried adding them, subtracting them, looking for prime numbers. Nothing. Then he remembered something from the Code Breakers, a section about book codes, where a string of numbers would reference specific pages and lines and words in a commonly available book. Both parties would need to own the same edition of the same book for the code to work. The Sears catalog was perfect for that. Millions of copies of the exact same book, distributed freely, sitting in homes across America, impossible to trace. What if the numbers weren't the code themselves, but coordinates pointing to other locations in the catalog? He took the first unusual phrase he'd found on page 127, item number 846234. He turned to page 84 in the catalog. On that page, he counted down to the 62nd line of text and looked at the 34th character. It was an M. He wrote it down. He took the second unusual phrase, page 316, item number 528915. He turned to page 52, counted to line 89, character 15. The letter T. He continued with the third, fourth, fifth phrases, MTSUNDAY. He stared at those 7 letters for a full minute before he realized what he was seeing. Empty Sunday. Mount Sunday, empty Sunday. Then it clicked. It wasn't MT, it was an abbreviation. Meeting, MT Sunday, Meet Sunday. His hands were shaking now as he worked through the rest of the unusual phrases he'd catalogued. 43 of them total, each one yielding a new letter or number based on the page line character coordinate system hidden in the item numbers. The full message, when he'd decoded all 43 phrases, read, Meet Sunday, 1800, Grant Park Bench, 47, red scarf, confirm, via usual channel package, ready. Michael sat at his desk, staring at what he'd written. And for the first time in the 3 weeks he'd been working on this problem, he felt genuinely afraid. This wasn't an academic exercise anymore. This was real. Someone had embedded a hidden message in the Sears catalog, a message about a meeting in Grant Park in Chicago, a meeting that would take place at 1800 hours, 6 o'clock in the evening, on a Sunday. Someone would be there wearing a red scarf. A package was ready. The language, the structure, the secrecy, it all pointed to one conclusion: espionage. He went downstairs and found his parents watching television in the den. His father was reading the newspaper. His mother was knitting. And the TV was playing some sitcom neither of them were really watching. Michael stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure how to start. Finally, he just said, "I need to show you something." His voice must have carried enough urgency that both parents looked up immediately. They followed him back upstairs to his room, where he'd laid out the catalog, his notebooks, his pages of calculations and failed attempts, and finally, the successful decryption. He explained everything, walking them through exactly how he'd found the pattern and how the code worked. Gordon Hartley's first reaction was skepticism. He picked up the notebook, looked at Michael's work, looked at the catalog, and asked his son if he was absolutely certain he'd done this correctly. Michael walked him through it again, step by step. Gordon was an engineer. He understood mathematical systems and logical processes. He could see that Michael's methodology was sound, that the pattern was real and not imagined. Patricia Hartley's first question was what they should do about it. Michael said he didn't know, which was why he was telling them. The three of them sat in Michael's room for nearly an hour, discussing possibilities. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe it was some kind of elaborate advertising game. Maybe it was a treasure hunt. But the language of the message didn't support those theories. Meet Sunday. Grant Park. Red scarf. Package ready. That was tradecraft language. That was how spies communicated. Gordon made the decision that they should call the FBI. It was late, after 10 o'clock, on a Friday night, but he looked up the number for the FBI's Chicago field office in the phone book and called the main line. He got a duty officer. Gordon explained that he had information about what might be a coded message being used for espionage and tried to convey that yes, he was serious, and no, this wasn't a prank. The duty officer, to his credit, took the information, including the Hartley family's address and phone number, and said someone would follow up. Gordon had no idea if anyone actually would, but someone did. On Monday morning, March 5th, an FBI agent named Thomas Covert called the Hartley home. Gordon was already at work, so Patricia answered and explained that her husband was the one who'd made the initial call, but that it was their son who'd actually discovered the code. Covert asked if he could come to the house that afternoon to discuss it further. Patricia said yes. That afternoon, around 3 o'clock, Covert arrived. He was in his late 30s, wearing a dark suit, polite but professionally skeptical. Patricia made coffee. Michael came home from school around 3:30 and found an FBI agent sitting at his kitchen table. Covert asked Michael to explain what he'd found. Michael did, pulling out the catalog and his notebooks, walking through the entire process just as he'd done for his parents. Kovacs listened, asked questions, took notes. He was particularly interested in the timing. When had the catalogue arrived? When had Michael first noticed the pattern? When had he cracked the code? Michael gave him the dates. February 7th for the catalogue's arrival, February 11th for noticing the pattern, March the 2nd for solving it. That meant the message had been sitting in the catalogue for nearly a month before anyone had decoded it. The meeting mentioned in the message, Meet Sunday, had presumably already happened. The exact date wasn't specified, and multiple Sundays had passed since the catalogue's arrival. But Kovacs explained that the catalogue was distributed over a period of several weeks, with different regions receiving it at different times. If the message was real, if this was actually an espionage communication system, the Sunday in question was probably not any specific calendar date, but rather the first Sunday after receipt of the catalogue, or perhaps a Sunday a certain number of weeks after receipt. That was how these things often worked, with timing codes that allowed for variations in distribution. Kovacs took the catalogue and Michael's notebooks with him when he left, promising to have analysts look at them. He told the Hartley family not to discuss this with anyone. He gave them his direct phone number and told them to call if they thought of anything else. Then he left, and the Hartley family was alone with the knowledge that their son had potentially uncovered a Soviet spy ring, and that the FBI was now involved in their lives. What the Hartley family didn't know, what Agent Kovacs didn't tell them that first day, was that the FBI had been looking for exactly this kind of operation for years. Soviet intelligence had a long history of using creative communication methods. In the 1950s and 60s, they'd used microdots, tiny photographs reduced to the size of a typewritten period, hidden in letters or magazines. They'd used invisible ink, radio transmissions, and elaborate dead drop systems where agents would leave materials in public locations to be picked up by other agents who'd never actually met face-to-face. But by the late 1970s, American counterintelligence had gotten very good at detecting those traditional methods. Microdots showed up under microscopic examination. Invisible ink could be revealed with chemical treatment. Radio transmissions could be triangulated. Dead drops could be surveilled. The FBI knew the Soviets must have developed new methods, cleaner methods, but they didn't know what those methods were. A communication system embedded in a mass-market catalog was brilliant in its simplicity. The Sears catalog was ubiquitous, untraceable, and completely innocent. A Soviet agent living in America could receive the catalog just like everyone else, could keep it on their coffee table or bookshelf without arousing any suspicion, and could decode messages at their leisure in the privacy of their own home. There was no suspicious radio equipment to explain, no furtive trips to parks or phone booths, no encrypted letters that might be intercepted. Just a catalog that millions of people received and that no one would think twice about. Within 48 hours of Agent Kovacs' visit to the Hartley home, a full team of FBI cryptanalysts and counterintelligence specialists were analyzing Michael's work. They verified his methodology, confirmed that the pattern was real, and began the process of trying to figure out who had created it and how many other catalogs might be affected. They pulled copies of previous Sears catalogs from the FBI's archive and from public libraries going back 2 years and began searching for similar patterns. They found them. The fall 1978 catalog had them. The spring 1978 catalog had them. The fall 1977 catalog had them. Each catalog contained between 35 and 50 unusually phrased product descriptions that, when decoded using the same page-line character system Michael had discovered, yielded a message. The messages were always brief, always operational. meeting locations, times, recognition signals, instructions for retrieving materials, confirmations of information passed. The FBI was looking at a communication network that had been operating successfully right under American noses for at least 2 years and possibly longer. The investigation, which the FBI codenamed Operation Catalog, expanded rapidly. FBI counterintelligence wanted to know how the messages were getting into the catalog in the first place. Sears Roebuck and Company was headquartered in Chicago, in the Sears Tower, which had just been completed in 1973 and was then the tallest building in the world. The catalog was produced by a massive operation involving hundreds of employees, copywriters, editors, photographers, designers, and production staff. Getting a coded message into the catalog would require someone on the inside, someone with access to the copywriting and editing process, who could insert unusual phrases into product descriptions without anyone noticing. FBI agents interviewed Sears executives on March 12, 1979, explaining only that they were investigating a possible security breach and requesting a full list of every employee who worked on catalog production. Sears cooperated fully, though the company's management was clearly bewildered about what the FBI was looking for. The list of employees was extensive, more than 300 people who had some level of access to catalog content. The FBI began the process of vetting all of them, running background checks, looking for any connection to Soviet intelligence or any suspicious activity. It was slow, methodical work. Meanwhile, the FBI was also trying to figure out who was receiving these messages and how. The messages themselves provided some clues. Meet Sunday, 1800 Grant Park Bench 47 Red Scarf. Grant Park was a massive public park in downtown Chicago, right on the waterfront of Lake Michigan. Bench 47 could mean anything. There were hundreds of benches in Grant Park, but the FBI agents familiar with the park recognized that many of the benches were actually numbered, a detail most visitors never noticed. The numbered benches were part of an adoption program where people could sponsor a bench in honor of someone, and each adopted bench had a small plaque with a number. Bench 47 existed. It was on the east side of the park, facing the lake, relatively isolated. The FBI put the bench under surveillance, though by this point, any meeting mentioned in the Spring catalog had presumably already occurred. They also went back through their archives, looking at previous decoded messages from older catalogs, trying to identify patterns in meeting locations and times. They found something interesting. Several of the messages referenced locations in Chicago, but several others referenced locations in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Cleveland. This wasn't a single-city operation. This was a regional network. The breakthrough in identifying the insider at Sears came on March 24, 1979, nearly 3 weeks into the investigation. FBI background checks had flagged a copywriter named Alexei Pitishin, age 41, who'd been working in Sears' catalog division. Pitishin was a naturalized American citizen, born in the Soviet Union but immigrated to the United States in 1962 at age 24, during a period when Soviet immigration restrictions had been briefly relaxed. He'd worked various jobs before landing at Sears, most recently as a technical writer for a manufacturing company. His work record was clean. His references had all checked out when Sears hired him, and he'd shown no signs of problems in his 3 years with the company. But the FBI's deeper investigation revealed something Sears hadn't known. Before immigrating to the United States, Pitishin had served in the Soviet Army for 3 years, including a stint with military intelligence. That detail had been omitted from his immigration paperwork. It wasn't proof of espionage, but it was enough to justify closer scrutiny. The FBI obtained authorization for surveillance and began monitoring Petishin's phone calls, mail, and movements. They also placed an undercover agent in the Sears catalog division, a woman who joined the team as a temporary copywriter and whose actual job was to observe Petishin's work habits and relationships. What they found over the next several weeks was a pattern of behavior that looked increasingly suspicious. Petishin worked unusual hours, often staying late at the office when most other employees had gone home. He had access to the catalog's editing system and regularly made what he described as minor corrections to product descriptions, changes that were small enough that they rarely got a second review. The undercover agent observed him making these changes late at night, working from a handwritten list he kept in his desk drawer, a list he was very careful to never leave unattended. On April 18, 1979, the FBI decided to make their move. They arrested Alexei Petishin at his home in Evanston, Illinois, at 6 o'clock in the morning. Simultaneously, they arrested 7 other individuals, 4 in Chicago, 2 in Milwaukee, and 1 in Cleveland, all of them suspected of being part of the communication network. The arrests were coordinated to happen at exactly the same time to prevent anyone from warning the others. The FBI operation was highly classified, and how they came to uncover other operatives remains a mystery to this day. Petishin's house was searched, and agents found materials that confirmed what they'd suspected. In a false bottom drawer in his bedroom dresser, hidden beneath layers of clothing, were 3 items: a one-time pad, a cipher key for encoding and decoding messages, a Soviet passport in his birth name, which was not Alexei Petishin, but Dmitry Kavarin, and a list of product categories and page ranges for the upcoming fall 1979 Sears catalog, with handwritten notes in Russian indicating which categories would carry the next round of encoded messages. The FBI had broken the ring, but the investigation was far from over. Petishin refused to cooperate, exercised his right to remain silent, and requested an attorney. The other arrested individuals, most of them Soviet nationals living in the United States on student or work visas, also refused to talk. But the evidence found in their homes and apartments painted a clear picture. These were KGB operatives running an intelligence-gathering network, and they'd been using the Sears catalog as their primary communication channel for at least 2 years, possibly longer. The information they were gathering, based on documents found during the raids, included technical specifications for American manufacturing equipment, details about industrial production methods, information about labor strikes and economic conditions in key industries, and maps of military installations and defense contractor facilities. It wasn't high-level military secrets, but it was valuable intelligence nonetheless, the kind of economic and industrial information that helped Soviet planners understand American manufacturing capabilities and vulnerabilities. The ring had been operating quietly and successfully, gathering information and passing it along through a communication system so simple and so hidden in plain sight that no one had thought to look for it, until a 13-year-old boy with autism and an obsession with codes decided to read the Sears catalog more carefully than probably anyone else in America had ever read it. The trial of Alexei Petishin began in September 1979 in U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. The case against him was built on the physical evidence found during the arrest and search of his house: the one-time pad, the cipher keys, the Soviet passport, combined with testimony from FBI agents about the catalog code system and its use. Michael Hartley was never called to testify. The FBI decided that his involvement wasn't necessary to prove the case, and they wanted to protect a minor from the scrutiny and potential danger that might come from being identified as the person who'd exposed the operation. The trial lasted 6 weeks. In November 1979, Alexei Pitishin was convicted on 4 counts of espionage under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 35 years in federal prison. The other defendants received sentences ranging from 10 to 25 years. 2 of them were Soviet nationals who were eventually deported after serving reduced sentences as part of a prisoner exchange in 1983. Pitishin remained in federal custody and was never exchanged. He died in prison in 1997. The FBI's investigation into how many other Sears catalogs might have carried encoded messages continued for another year. They examined every catalog going back to 1975, when Pitishin was first believed to have been approached by Soviet intelligence. In the end, they found encoded messages in 12 different catalog editions, including specialty catalogs produced between 1977 and spring 1979. The fall 1979 catalog and all later Big Book editions were clean, because by that point, the FBI had quietly worked with Sears to implement additional review procedures for catalog copy to prevent any similar infiltration in the future. Sears itself was never implicated in any wrongdoing. The company had been exploited by a Soviet operative who'd infiltrated their workforce, but there was no evidence that anyone at Sears beyond Pitishin had known what was happening. Michael Hartley's role remained classified for years. He and his family were instructed not to discuss what had happened, and they complied. Life returned to something resembling normal, though normal now included occasional visits from FBI agents who had follow-up questions or wanted Michael's help analyzing similar patterns in other documents. Michael went back to school, back to his math classes and his notebooks full of ciphers. His teachers never knew that their quiet, awkward student had cracked a Soviet spy code. His classmates never knew that the kid who sat in the back of class working on college math problems had also helped the FBI make one of the most significant counterintelligence arrests of the late Cold War era. Michael Hartley graduated from high school in 1983, enrolled at MIT, where he studied mathematics, earned his PhD by 1991, and went on to have a distinguished career in cryptography and computer security, eventually working for a defense contractor on classified projects. He never spoke publicly about the Sears catalog case again, though people who knew him and knew his story said he remained interested in patterns and codes throughout his life. The Sears catalog itself continued publication until 1993, when the company discontinued the big book format in favor of specialty catalogs, a victim of changing retail trends and the rise of computerized shopping systems. At its peak, the catalog reached 40 million American households and was arguably the most widely distributed single document in the United States. How many other people received those catalogs between 1977 and 1979 and never noticed the pattern hidden inside them? Millions. Michael Hartley was the only one who saw it, the only one whose particular way of thinking made those slightly awkward phrases stand out as anomalies worth investigating. In the vast machinery of Cold War intelligence and counterintelligence, with its satellites and supercomputers and armies of analysts, one 13-year-old boy's obsessive attention to detail and pattern recognition achieved what everyone else had missed.